Oh, I just lost the video. But anyway, what I was saying is that this idea of ITO I've been talking about, that's just a somewhat formal symbolism, so I can have some shorthand to talk about these ideas. And the real idea is analyzing ideas, all human ideas, in terms of a thinking process and input and outputs, the observed outputs. So, this really is meant to change the question. There's lots of ways and details to change that formalism, or even have a totally separate formalism that still share the characteristic of looking at the question differently. So, like, take religion, take a religious question: does God exist? You know, the classical formalism, you start to try to answer that, and you draw from conclusions. You have difficulties dealing with the fact that principles still need to be proven, and so on and so forth. But with, if we think of it as input-output processing, we say, well, there's an idea of God existing, and there's a thinking process that produces it, and there's inputs that are available information that informs that thinking process. And we ask about that. You know, the question of if it's compelling or not becomes secondary, and we are also able to picture and graph and chart, multiple ideas. Because there's multiplicity on all these levels. There's different ideas of God, there's different ways of thinking that produce them, and there's different input sets. And we can ask a lot of interesting questions playing with these variables, by formalizing it. Given a fixed set of inputs, how do the different ways of thinking produce outputs? Which ones produce that there is a God? Are there certain ways of thinking that no matter what the inputs produce God? Are there certain that would produce God under certain inputs and not under others? Like, if somebody is raised in a Truman Show kind of situation, maybe they could be induced, even though they're using a rational way of thinking, to believe in God because their inputs have been manipulated, right? It was rational of him to think that that make-believe town was real. And yet, in another situation, that rational mind would conclude something different. Okay. Whereas a lot of religious, or I can think of some Christian ways of thinking, it seems like no matter what the inputs are, it produces a belief in God. It leads to evidence of God. Okay, so when we're asking these questions, we get into all the truth. We lose nothing. I ask for the contemplative people to contemplate this. We lose nothing in our ability to get information about, theology. In fact, we gain the ability to distinguish between different beliefs in God, what led to them, and compare those and decide maybe our own beliefs based on that. And ultimately, it's simply, it's a cognitive science tool where we work on the way we're thinking, because that is the part that is reactive to various inputs. And if we can anticipate future sets of input, then we can produce ways of thinking that will get the desired results that we want. Okay, and so it's the refocus from this one question of the correctness, like, well, no, just tell me ontologically, does God exist, which we know is fraught with all these issues of ontological certainty and stuff, into a question of, well, how do you think about what you've seen, and why does that make you believe what you believe? Okay, cheers.